So this week, what I'm talking about is the world's most expensive art. I'll talk about how I define that in a moment, but it raises the question, as you know, hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on some works of art. Is it all a big con? Why is so much money spent? I'll address that to begin with. Let's look at the top 10. The way that I identified the top 10 works is I simply took the top 10 works of art as listed by Wikipedia on January 2022. It's obviously changing all the time, but this is quite a good representative set. And I'll start by addressing this question of why are they so much money spent on them? Well, to begin with, there are a few artists that do show us the world in a new way. And that's difficult with billions of images in the modern world, advertising, newspapers, television, websites, and so on. It's difficult to look at the world in a novel way. And there are a few artists who I think can see the world in new ways, and that enables us to see the world in new and exciting ways. But how do we recognize these special artists? Well, of course, there's a shortcut, and that is we just look for those artists that are famous. In other words, artists that many people, art experts, for example, have decided are special. But how does that translate into how much one should pay for their work of art? And that leads us straight into the depths of the art market. Now, art is, aside from everything else, is a form of investment. So if you like art and you're worth billions, then spending a few hundred million on a work may make sense if you're sure the value will increase. So you get something that you like to look at, but it's also a good investment. Now, historically, many works of famous artists have appreciated in value faster than other assets. Although, on the other hand, art is a very risky investment. So there's that balance between getting a good return, getting something that you like to look at, but played off against the risk. Many people can afford to take that risk. I checked, and Forbes magazine identified in 2022 that there were 2,668 billionaires in the world. The museums, and that's individuals, so the museums and art galleries are also potential buyers as well. So in a way, these high prices are misleading. Let's use that word rather than a con, as they solely depend on the opinion of art experts and what other people have paid for works of art. So there are some things like a house, for example, that you can live in have intrinsic value. But artworks, the ones I'm going to show you today, are just a few relatively cheap pigments smeared on a canvas. So their value depends on their uniqueness and, of course, what someone's willing to pay for them. So let's get started. And we'll go backwards. So we'll start with number 10. Modigliani. This is New Couché, which was sold at Christie's in New York in 2015 for $170 million. It was sold to a Chinese businessman, Liu Yiqin, who's a billionaire and an art collector. It's said that he paid for it using his American Express card. It was, at the time in 2015, the second highest price ever paid for a work of art at auction. And you might wonder, well, how did he make so much money to be able to afford a work of art like this? Interestingly, Liu Yiqin left school when he was 14 because he lived in a poor family, and he needed to help his mother sell handbags on the street. And he then worked for 2 years as a taxi driver, and he made his fortune buying shares privately in the new companies that were formed in the 1990s in China, before those companies were listed. In fact, the first company he bought shares from, he received back, when the company floated, 60 times what he'd invested. And he just carried on multiplying his investments. But let's get back to this painting. How did it come about? Well, in 1917, there was a Polish dealer, Leopold Borowski, who commissioned Modigliani with studio space, and he paid Modigliani 15 francs a day. He paid the models 5 francs a day to pose for him, and he commissioned Modigliani to paint a series of nudes. Altogether, Modigliani painted 22 reclining nudes and 13 seated nudes as part of this commission. They are very different from what had been painted previously. They dominate the canvas, they fill the canvas, their arms and legs stretch out and are chopped off by the edges of the canvas. Their nudity has been described as self-assured and proud, rather than being cloaked in myth or allegory. In other words, they don't represent some classical goddess. They're simply nudes. Now, they were exhibited in Paris at the time. They caused crowds to develop outside the gallery. In fact, there was a police station opposite. A police officer came in and asked them to be removed, as he considered them indecent. The art gallery owner refused. Some accounts differ at this point. Some say the gallery was closed, others say it remained open, but only 2 drawings were sold at, for a small amount of money, 30 francs each. However, they did later, after Modigliani had died, become collectible, and most of them are now found in museums around the world and are very unlikely ever to come onto the market. This one was an exception. It's now in private collection. A little bit, excuse me, the remnants of my cold. The little bit about Modigliani himself: he led a very tragic life. In fact, when he was born, the day he was born coincided with the financial collapse of his father's business. Now, luckily for his parents, there was an ancient law which said that creditors couldn't seize the bed or goods of a pregnant woman or mother with a newborn child. And he was literally born as the bailiffs entered the house, and his parents piled all their valuables onto the bed and thus protected them. Anyway, from interesting story, but from an early age, he was an artist. He considered himself a painter before he was even trained. His family regarded him as an artist from a very early age. Unfortunately, when he was 14, he was struck with typhoid fever, and they thought he would die. One of his requests was that he wanted to see the paintings in the Uffizi in Florence, and his mother promised to take them there when he recovered. He did recover. She took him to Florence, and then when they returned, she enrolled him in the art class of the leading artist in their town of Livorno, and he studied under that artist. He developed tuberculosis when he was 16, and it was a disease that eventually killed him. He tried to hide the fact that he had tuberculosis all of his life, and it's said that the reason he drank so much and took drugs was to hide the symptoms. He he knew that drunks and drug addicts were tolerated by the artists in Paris, but carriers of tuberculosis were not. So he hid the disease behind his drunkenness and his drug taking. In 1917, he met a young French art student that we see here, Jeanne Auburtin, and they fell deeply in love, and she became the most important person in his life, and he painted her more than any others of his models, although he never painted her nude. She was 19 and he was 33. They quickly moved in together. They lived in a studio apartment on the top floor overlooking Paris. It was a ramshackle place, but Modigliani was thrilled about it. She became the mother of their child. The two were engaged to be married, but he was in the grip of drug addiction, which made his health even worse, and he died in January 1920 when he was 35. So although they had an intense relationship, they had only been together for 2.5 years, and she was so distraught that even though she was pregnant with their second child, she committed suicide by throwing herself from a 4-story window. Let's move on to a happier work, The Women of Algiers by Picasso. This was one of a series of 15 paintings that were painted by Picasso and inspired by Eugène Delacroix's painting, The Women of Algiers, in their apartment, which I'll show you in a moment. And this painting is the final painting of those 15, and it's called version O. The others are versions A to N. And it's both it's an homage to Matisse, who died the previous year, 1954. And it led to Picasso engaging in a project which included a number of paintings and a number of studies. So it was both an homage to Matisse, who just died, and also a celebration of the work of Delacroix, who Picasso considered his predecessor in terms of colour and Oriental subject matter. And he'd been fascinated, and he often visited the Louvre to see Delacroix's Women of Algiers. Let's look at them. This is the Delacroix women, the Women of Algiers in their apartment, painted in 1834. And there are, in fact, 2 versions of this painting, and this is the perhaps the best known, the one in the Louvre. This work inspired many artists, including Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin. And Cézanne described this painting as all this luminous color. It seems to me that it enters the eye like a glass of wine running into your gullet, and it makes you drunk straight away. Picasso used to visit the Louvre, as I said, but he visited it every month to look at this painting. And when his partner, François Gillot, asked him how he felt about Delacroix, it's said that he said about him, "That bastard, he's really good." It also should be mentioned, and I'll refer to this in a moment, that he painted multiple versions of Velázquez' La Meninas, and it's possible his painting is a reference to that, with this in the background that I'm pointing with my mouse here. This mirror in the background is a reference to Las Meninas. It's been praised and compared with Ingres' painting of the Grand Odalisque and the Turkish bath, and Renoir's Parisians in Algerian costume. Let me show you the Renoir. This is another painting inspired by Delacroix, who was a hero of Renoir. And again, he painted this painting as a homage to Delacroix. And it was Renoir who described the Delacroix painting as the most beautiful picture in existence. Note, by the way, that Renoir isn't pretending that this is an Algerian harem. He knew, and in fact, maybe as a humorous reference here, he knew Delacroix had never entered a harem, and neither had Renoir. So he calls his Parisians in Algerian costume, sort of admitting the fact that this is some Parisian models that he'd hired for the picture. The woman on the right, by the way, the one here, is holding up a mirror, while the woman on the left is applying makeup using this brush here. And someone's just arrived at the door, and one reading of this is that it's a male client has arrived in a Parisian brothel, which is decorated with this ornamental theme. The other homage, and there's multiple references in Picasso's work, but the other one is to Matisse, as I said, who died the year before. And Matisse painted a number of odalisques. This is odalisque with grey trousers. And in fact, Matisse said that I paint odalisques in order to paint the nude. Otherwise, how is the nude to be painted without being artificial? Well, we did see one way with Modigliani, but also Matisse said, I also know they exist. I was in Morocco, I saw them. So returning to the Picasso, Women of Algiers, you can see it's inspired by multiple sources, and I'm showing you here the Delacroix, top left, the Matisse and its eroticism. Bottom left is Ingres, Grand Odalisque, and the reference to the mirror I mentioned, Las Meninas by Velázquez. This mirror in the background there, mirroring the mirror in Picasso. But let's move on to a very different painting. Number 8 is Rembrandt, the pendant portraits of Martin Solmans and Objen Coppet, which is in, well, it's shared between the Rijksmuseum and the Louvre. And the reason is that they bought it jointly in 2016 for 180, well, they bought the two of them, I should say, jointly for $180 million. And they bought them privately from Eric de Rothschild. So it's a pendant pair painted in 1634 when Rembrandt was at the height of his career. He was 28 years old, and they're the only full-length portraits by Rembrandt. And it was a format, the full-length portrait was a format that was rare in Holland, although it was common in Flanders. And we believe Rembrandt chose this format to reinforce their high social standing. Now, Martin Solmans was the son of a refugee, so came from a poorer family, but Objen Coppet was from a very wealthy family and was the most sought after catch in Amsterdam at the time. He's united the two paintings with this black curtain. He's linked them together, and he's also linked them by introducing some animation with Martin Solmans holding out a glove, which, by the way, was a sign of fidelity. And she is stepping towards them. It's a bit hard to see, but she's just come down a step towards him. Black by the way, was a fashionable color at the time, as it was the most expensive cloth. And it enabled Rembrandt, who was a master of light and subtle differences and tones and textures, to show the different types of material that they're wearing, the light silk and the quilted satin contrasting with each other. Rembrandt at the time is, or Rembrandt today, is probably best known for his self-portraits, and this is self-portrait with velvet beret, and I'm showing it to you because he painted it the same year, and he's probably best known for his portraits, well, except for the painting I'm going to show you next. And he's, according to the art critic Kenneth Clark, Rembrandt, with the possible exception of Van Gogh, is the only artist who made the self-portrait a major means of artistic self-expression, and he turned the self-portrait into an autobiography. And here he's saying something about how proud he is of being the leading artist in Amsterdam, because the hat that he's wearing was the beret that was typical of a painter. It was an attribute of the painter. It's what painters wore. So he's showing himself proudly as a painter. He was born and trained in Leiden and moved to Amsterdam a few years before, in 1631. And this is the perhaps the most famous work by Rembrandt, certainly the most famous work at the Rijksmuseum. Many people visit the Rijksmuseum to see the Night Watch. By the way, it's called the Night Watch. It darkened over the years and it became known as the Night Watch in the 18th century. But we now believe it's not actually set at night, and it's more formally known as Militia Company of District 2 under the command of Captain Franz Bannock Koch. But everyone calls it the Night Watch. It was a first, and it was controversial at the time. It was first in that it was the first to show a group engaged in an activity, and that is what made it controversial, because typically paintings of groups like a militia company, everybody would be shown sort of standing in rows where everybody's portrait had equal prominence, because the members of the company paid for Rembrandt to produce their portrait, and that's what they expected. And so this was controversial because some of the people are hidden away at the back and quite difficult to see, but they had to pay for the painting as much as those shown in the front. It's now owned by the city of Amsterdam, and we've got no idea how much it's worth, but it's been estimated to be worth over $500 million, and so it is actually worth more than any of the paintings I'll show you today. But it's not, of course, ever likely to come up for sale, and that's an important point, that some of the most potentially expensive paintings in the world are locked into the major museums, luckily, so that we can see them, and they were never ever likely to come up for sale. But let's move back again to a modern work of art and a big contrast to Rembrandt. It's Mark Rothko. He's number 7 with this number 6, violet, green and red. Its sale was actually contentious, and it's a story that's going to come up again as I go through these works. Let me just give you the initial facts of it. It was privately bought for 140 million euros by a Russian billionaire called Dmitry Rybolovlev. He thought he'd bought the painting through the Swiss dealer Yves Bouvier, and he assumed the dealer was earning standard commission. However, he found out later that Bouvier had actually purchased the painting for around 80 million euros before selling it to him for 140 million euros, making a 60 million euro profit. The Russian wasn't aware of this at the time, but when he found out, he became very angry. He accused Bouvier, because he'd bought many paintings through him, of swindling him out of 1.1 billion euros, because he'd bought 2 billion euros worth of paintings, 38 works over 9 years before he found out. And the Russian took him to court in 6 countries. And I'll tell you more about the outcome and some of those other works that he'd bought later. But let's come back to Rothko. Enough of the art market. This is another work by Rothko that you might have seen, because it's one of the 9 works in the Tate. They have been in the Turner Gallery at Tate, that they were in the Tate Modern. They were moved to the Turner, close to the Turner Gallery in Tate Britain. The Turner Gallery has just closed for a rehang, and during that rehang, I believe that the Rothkos are going to move back to Tate Modern. Now, Rothko was a Latvian, became American, so a Latvian-American painter, and became one of the most important abstract expressionists, also known as colour-filled painting, in the 1950s and 60s. And this painting is one of 9, in fact, he painted more actually, but commissioned for the Four Seasons restaurant in the Seagram building in New York, which is why they're called the Seagram murals. He spent 8 months painting them, and then he decided that he wouldn't supply them to the restaurant, so they were never sent to the restaurant, and he returned the money he'd been advanced. And there are a lot of reasons given as to why he wouldn't supply them. I think the most accurate is probably what he told a fellow passenger on his return from Europe. He visited Europe to see Turner's and works in Italy. And on the journey back, he was chatting one evening to a passenger who perhaps he didn't know was editor of Harper's Magazine, who after the conversation went back to his cabin and wrote notes of the talk. And one of the things that Rothko told him is that he would never supply the works to the Seagram building because, and I quote, "It's a place where the richest bastards in New York will come and feed and show off." And he went on to say, "I accepted this assignment as a challenge with strictly malicious intentions. I hope to paint something that will ruin the appetite of every son of a bitch who ever eats in that room," end quote. And my feeling as to the reason he didn't actually supply them is because when he got back from Europe, he visited the restaurant, and I think that the restaurant is very large, has got big windows, is very light and airy. And I think Rothko realized that his paintings wouldn't create the atmosphere and the effect that he wanted. And it would just be the diners there would just look at them. And by at this point, Rothko was becoming a very well-known painter in New York. They would just look around the room and say, "Oh, how amusing that Rothko's that they've paid Rothko to put some of his paintings up." And so he refused to supply them. He got into conversation with the director of the Tate, who eventually managed to persuade him to donate them to the Tate. And in fact, the day they arrived at the Tate and the boxes were opened was the day in February 1970 that Mark Rothko committed suicide in New York. Let's switch to a happier work. Painting by Klimt, Water Serpents, or Wasserschlangen 2, painted in 1907. This painting has been involved in controversies as well. First, many of the critics thought it represented 4 water nymphs. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that was uncontroversial. That was acceptable. That was acceptable because they were mythological. However, other critics started to worry about whether it represented a lesbian orgy of 4 women, and their fears were confirmed when Klimt painted this painting, which is called Women Friends, and it clearly shows a lesbian relationship more openly. So that was the first controversy surrounding this painting. Secondly, the ownership was later disputed. It was first owned by a Jewish woman, Jeanne Steiner, who lived in Vienna, but she was forced to flee, and it was confiscated by the Nazis, and it was given to Gustav Urzecki. And when he died in 1961, so much later, it passed to his wife, who then, much later still in 2012, put it up for sale. When it was put up for sale, that brought it to the attention of the heirs of Jens Steiner, the original owner, and it was agreed the proceeds would be split 50-50, and it was sold for $112 million. So they each received $56 million. The following year, and Yves Bouvier comes back again, in 2013, Yves Bouvier bought and then sold this work to the Russian billionaire, and he was the one who paid $112 million for it, and he sold it to the Russian billionaire for 183 million, making 71 million profit, and that's in addition to the 60 million profit that he made from the Rothko that I just mentioned, and there's more to come. Before I move on though, because he painted it the same year, I thought I'd show you Klimt's masterpiece of his golden period, and it's the work I believe that's most loved by the public. You see it everywhere in reproductions. It's an icon of the Jugendstil, the German and Viennese Art Nouveau movement. It's thought that the model, that it's Klimt and his companion Emil Flöger who modeled for the work, but there isn't actually, that's generally assumed to be the case, but there's no actual evidence as to who the model was. He was at this time one of the leading artists in Vienna. He was awarded the Golden Order of Merit from the Emperor. He was only 26. I mentioned he just met Emil Flöger, who became his companion until the end of his life. And it's some people think, as I said, that this painting, The Kiss, is a picture of the two of them as lovers. But during this period, with multiple women, he fathered at least 14 children. This was the high point of his reputation, and which declined from this point because of the various controversies around his work. But let's move to, well, another controversial work, I guess, certainly controversial at the time, Jackson Pollock's number 17A, which was purchased for $200 million by a hedge fund manager, Kenneth Griffin, in 2015. It was then, when it was bought, it was a record-breaking price. It's now number 5 in the list of the most expensive paintings, and it was lent to I think it will still be on display at the Art Institute of Chicago. It's painted on fiberboard. It's a drip painting created by splashing paint onto a horizontal surface. And it was painted just a year after Jackson Pollock introduced or started to use his this drip painting technique. So it's an early drip painting, painted in 1948. And it was featured in Life magazine the following year in 1949. And in fact, it made Jackson Pollock famous and for some people infamous. I think what I'll do is let me show you this painting. It's in the Metropolitan Museum, another painting by Pollock, Autumn Rhythm, perhaps well, I believe a better known work. It's called Autumn Rhythm number 30, painted in 1950. Now, Pollock would lay an unprimed canvas on the floor horizontally and then splash or drip usually enamel paints using brushes and syringes. And what I thought, I'd just take it aside here, there's something intrinsically appealing about Pollock's work that is perhaps explained, or some people have tried to explain it by considering the mathematics of what's called fractal geometry. And let me try and explain. A fractal is a pattern that appears similar at different scales. Or in other words, as you zoom in, you see more detail that has a similar pattern. Organic forms often are fractal, for example, like a cloud, or maybe a better example is a tree. If you, I think I've got, yes, if you, this is a fractal generated tree, but you can see the similarity to a tree. A tree is some big branches branching out, but then when you look more closely, it's smaller branches branching and then smaller still branches, and it's self-similar is another way these are described. It's, if you look more closely, you see something similar to the bigger picture. As you zoom in, the detail is similar to the larger picture. And Pollock paintings have and it can be measured scientifically, have a fractal dimension, which puts them on a scale, normally as it's a flat picture between 1 and 2. Clouds, for example, have a fractal dimension of about 1.3, and Pollock's paintings on that scale have a fractal dimension of between 1.8 and 1.9. Let me show you another way, a mathematical way of representing fractals and zooming in and seeing something similar as you get closer. We are zooming in on what's called technically a Mandelbrot set. And as we zoom into the detail, you can see the detail looks like the larger picture, and then we zoom in more detail and more detail. Then these patterns are generated from a mathematical formula, which is called, which was analyzed by the mathematician Mandelbrot, which is why it's called a Mandelbrot set. Now, if you, I'll finish on this point now. If you create Pollock paintings mathematically, then, and you ask people, then 94% prefer the fractal paintings. And I'm not saying Pollock was aware of fractal geometry. It was before, he painted them before Mandelbrot, but he was unconsciously creating self-similar organic forms that are aesthetically pleasing, is what I'm saying. And what that means is that it's actually very difficult to fake Pollock painting. It's difficult to create them because of this self-similarity at different zoom levels. But let me move on to a very different painting. Number 4. This is Paul Gauguin, a contentious artist today, of course, because of his sexual relationships with young girls, his abandonment of his family, his violence, his racism, and so on. But looking at his work in context at the time, he found it, he was a known artist in Paris, but he found it difficult to sell his work. His fame only began to grow shortly after his death in 1903. And in fact, many of his works were then bought by Russian collectors, and many of his works are now in Russia, in the Pushkin Museum and in the Hermitage. But this painting, When Will You Marry, is an 1892 work, and it was bought, or it became the, at the time, the third most expensive artwork when it was bought for $210 million in 2014. And it's believed that the buyer was the Guitar Museum. Just a comment on Gauguin and his view of himself. I found a quote that, something that he said just before he died, that was, "I have wished to establish the right to dare. The public owes me nothing, since my achievement in painting is only relatively good. But the painters who today profit by this liberty, they owe something to me." End quote. In other words, it's interesting that he believed that the public would only be marginally interested in his work because he thought he was only a relatively good painter. However, he did believe that his paintings were pushing the boundaries of what artists were doing, and that they would have a great influence on art and artists of the future. And in fact, that's exactly what happened after his death. He became very influential. One of the artists that he influenced greatly was Picasso. Now, this was painted in 1892, and Gauguin first set sail from Paris to Tahiti in the previous year, in 1891, and he believed that by visiting what he called a primitive and savage society, he would escape from everything that was artificial and conventional, and that he would produce a new type of art that would make his fortune, that he would come back from Tahiti and sell his work and become a famous artist. It didn't happen that way. He sent 9 paintings back to Paris and was told they were well received, but in fact they'd been unfavorably compared with Van Gogh's work. But he didn't know that, and encouraged by that misleading message, he returned to Paris with 70 works, expecting to sell them all, but in fact he couldn't sell them, and lost or fired his main dealer, the famous Drouin Rouel, the most successful Parisian dealer of Impressionist paintings, who couldn't sell them. So he returned to Tahiti and never came back to Europe again. There's an interesting story, actually, of how a valuable painting can go unrecognized. This is a more recent, though. In 1970, one of Gauguin's paintings, called Fruits on a Table, I think I've got it here, yeah, this painting, was stolen from a private house in London. And 5 years later, it was bought by a Fiat employee who bought it at a railway lost property sale for the equivalent of about £30. And he bought it not because he knew it was Gauguin, but because he liked it. And it was until 2014 when he or somebody said that he should get it valued. He called in a valuer who identified it, and the painting was discovered. And at that point, it then had an estimated value of about £30 million. It would be worth a lot more today. And in fact, I think it's still under dispute, because under Italian law, if someone buys a work in good faith, which the factory worker did, then they own the painting. Now, so first of all, in 2014, the work of this work was returned to the Fiat factory worker by a court in Rome, and then the original, in fact, an heir of the original owner, Terence Kennedy, made a claim, and I think it's still being disputed in the courts as to how that would be resolved. Maybe it'll be resolved in the way the previous painting we saw, the Klimt, was resolved by splitting the proceeds 50-50, but we shall see. This is perhaps Gauguin's most famous painting, Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? That he painted a few years later in Tahiti, 1897. I think, though, that I'll well, let me just mention this. Let me just talk about this painting and why, and the title. It represents the beginning of life, which we see on the right. It goes from right to left, where we see the young child, a family group. In the middle is the daily life of young adulthood, including a woman. The woman there in the center is picking a fruit as a reference to Eve. And the group on the left, well, Gauguin wrote, an old woman approaching death appears reconciled and resigned to her thoughts. There's a strange white bird, represents the futility of words, or the uselessness of vain words, Gauguin wrote. And so it represents a sort of cycle of birth, sin, and death. And the figure, the idol, the statue in blue, Gauguin said represents the beyond. And so it's a sort of semi-mystical painting representing life. And that's why he called it Where Do We Come From? What Are We? Where Are We Going? When it was exhibited, incidentally, in Paris, it was a mild success, and it was eventually, this painting was sold for 2,500 francs. Not a large sum, but not an insignificant sum. This, I think I've, yeah, this is the one I wanted to show you. This is the card, or I should say it's one of the card players by Cézanne. It says private collection, but you might be thinking, hold on, I've seen this painting in the Courtauld, Cézanne's The Card Players, or some of you might be thinking I saw it at the Musée d'Orsay, or some of you at the Met in New York, or again in the Art Gallery in Philadelphia. And in fact, you're all correct. Cézanne painted 5 versions over a few years, and I'll show you all 5. But let me just tell you about the sale of this one. It was bought in 2011 by a Greek shipping magnate, George Embirikos, who sold this one to the state of Qatar by private sale. And we don't know the price they paid, but we think it's not recorded in my list because we don't know the price, but we think it was between $250 and $300 million. At the time, the highest price ever paid for a painting. Now, Cézanne is adopting or adapting a theme from 17th century Dutch and French artists, which is people playing at cards. in the Dutch artists often showed them drunk or rowdy gamblers, but instead here Cézanne is showing them as somber, stony-faced Provençal card players, concentrating on their hands, no sense of fun. It's like a still human life. But let's look at all five. They vary in size, and I've arranged them roughly in order of size. The largest is in Philadelphia, and it's the top left, and it's the first that he painted, 1890. It's less perhaps stylized than some of the later ones. The next one is the one that was sold to Qatar. That's the one on the top right, and then bottom left is the one that you'll see in the Musée d'Orsay, the Met, the Metropolitan Museum. Then the next one is the one at the Courtauld, which looks similar but more, perhaps more somber colouring. And then the final one is the one at the Musée d'Orsay, and is the smallest, and is the final one that he painted. The most closely cropped, you'll see, where he's concentrating on the card players, is zoomed in slightly. Right, sorry about that. They were in the wrong place. Number 2, we're getting close to the end. William de Kooning, born in Rotterdam. Parents divorced when he was 3. He left school when he was 12, became an apprentice commercial artist, went to evening classes, and then traveled to New York as a stowaway when he was 22. And when he arrived, he got work as a house painter and carpenter and commercial artist. Met other artists, became a full-time artist. And this is one of his, that was, he became fairly well known in New York when he painted a mural for the 1939 World's Fair in New York, which was some 13 years after he arrived in New York as a stowaway. And that started to establish his career. He was influenced by Franz Klein, who joined with him, and Jackson Pollock, and they broke away from other artists to create a new artistic movement. It was in the late 40s and early 50s that his reputation started to grow. And in 1953, he shocked the world by exhibiting a series of aggressively painted figure works, commonly known as the women paintings. And this one is one of the, in fact, it's the last of the woman series. And it's difficult to see a woman there except the pink, the sort of fleshy pink mass in the center represents a woman. I'll show you a slightly earlier painting, well, in fact, an even earlier painting, and an earlier painting in the woman's series. It was originally sold by de Kooning for $4,000, but by 2015, it was bought by Kenneth Griffith, the person I mentioned before, the hedge fund manager, who bought it for $300 million. And I mentioned his name when talking about the Pollock that he bought for $200 million the same year. He obviously made a lot of money as a hedge fund manager. I said I'd show a much earlier work. Remember, he got well known at the New York Trade Fair in 1939. The following year, this is an example of his early work, and his work developed through abstraction and then back to figurative or semi-figurative by the early 1950s. And this is one of the early works in the Woman series that I mentioned. So between this 1940 work and this work, he'd gone through an abstract painting period. He famously said, "Flesh is the reason oil paint was invented," and he kept returning to figure painting, and in a semi-abstract way, sometimes more abstract than others. The Woman series are those that are obviously centered on the female figure and painted between 50 and 53, roughly. Incidentally, this Woman series here, he made many preliminary studies, and he repainted the canvas repeatedly, often scraping away and reworking the image, sometimes over a period of nearly 2 years, which is why the date is 1950 to 52. He started it in 50, but it took him 2 years to complete the work. Finally, Salvator Mundi set a new record for sale price of $450 million when auctioned at Christie's in 2017. A controversial work for two reasons. First of all, it's not universally accepted to be by Leonardo da Vinci. Obviously, that price, $450 million, indicates that some people believe it's a genuine Leonardo. Some people believe it's a later copy of a lost original painting, so by another artist. Some people believe that when it was first purchased, it was much damaged, and that a lot of the painting wasn't just restored, it was repainted. So some people think it's more of the work of the restorer than of the original artist, whether the original artist was Leonardo or another artist copying a Leonardo. There are X-rays show that changes were made to the composition, and that's an indication that it's not a copy, but that it's an original. And if somebody is painting a copy in order to create a copy, they're unlikely to make changes. They'll be copying the original exactly. So it seems unlikely that it was, for that reason, that it was a copy of a lost original. Now, the second controversy comes back to Rybolovlev's purchase of the painting from Bouvier. Bouvier bought it for $83 million, here we go again, and sold it to the Russian billionaire for $127.5 million. And the Russian then resold the work at Christie's for the world record price I mentioned of $450 million, which means that the Russian billionaire made $270 million profit on the resale. Despite that, he brought a case or cases in 6 countries against Bouvier variously of fraud, mismanagement, breach of trust, and money laundering. And in 2021, Swiss judges, which was one of the countries he brought the cases, dismissed all charges against Bouvier. One of the charges was that he'd overcharged him as much as $1 billion for 40, some say 38 artworks over the previous 9 or 10 years. And Bouvier claims that he wasn't contractually acting as an agent with a set percentage charge. He was acting, there was no contract, he was acting independently, and he was perfectly entitled to buy a work and then resell it for more money. And that's in fact what the Swiss judges ruled. However, one of the charges of money laundering was translated by the authorities in Switzerland into a charge of avoiding paying taxes, which is a complicated case which is still ongoing, because Bouvier claimed that he lived in Singapore. The Swiss authorities claim he lived in Switzerland, and that he had not paid the appropriate, the appropriate taxes on these sales to the Russian billionaire. Anyway, whatever the outcome of all of these cases, Bouvier has said he's now writing a book about the whole long-running saga, so we'll be able to hear his view of what happened. I thought I'd end with Leonardo's most famous painting and perhaps some odd facts you might not know. Leonardo lived and died in France, born obviously in or near the town of Vinci in Italy. But towards the end of his life, he went to work for King Francois I of France, and he took the Mona Lisa with him. It was displayed in the Fontainebleau Palace after he died, and then later transferred to the Palace of Versailles. And I don't know whether you know, but Napoleon kept it in his bedroom before it was moved to the Louvre. Secondly, it's thought to be unfinished. Towards the end of his life, when he was living in France, it's believed his right arm became paralyzed and that he never finished the Mona Lisa. Where's the evidence for that? Well, some people claim that this portrait by Giovanni Ambrogio Figini shows Leonardo with his right arm covered in a cloth and his hand clenched in a way that indicates it's paralyzed. Now, this was painted sometime many years after Leonardo had died. It was a posthumous portrait. Some people claim it's not a portrait, which is why it's called Sketch of an Old Man. Some people give it as evidence for his hand being paralyzed, but we also have a record of a visit by Louis de Aragon in 1517 to Leonardo, and Aragon describes that Leonardo's right hand was paralyzed and had been paralyzed from the age of 65. Some people incidentally think the lack of eyebrows on the Mona Lisa was proof that it's unfinished, but others claim it was a fashion at the time to shave your eyebrows. However, detailed scientific analysis of the painting shows that Leonardo had once painted on eyebrows and bolder eyelashes, but they faded over time. Some people claim it's a self-portrait, believe it or not. This portrait here, portrait of a man in red chalk, is not universally but widely accepted to be a self-portrait by Leonardo. So this is one of the few pictures we have of what he might have looked like. And in fact, I've reversed this work so that the person is facing in the direction of the Mona Lisa, so you can compare it. And well, to me, it doesn't look like a portrait, but that is one of the claims. You might also know that, or maybe you don't know, that it was the Mona Lisa was stolen in 1911, and the playwright and poet Guillaume Apollinaire was arrested as the thief in September of that year, questioned for a week and held in prison for a week before being released because there was no evidence. And then the authorities turned on Pablo Picasso as the next possible suspect. Pablo Picasso wasn't the international star that he became, but he was a well-known artist in Paris at the time, but there was no evidence. The case was dropped. Finally, 2 years later, a glazier, Vincenzo Perugia, a glazier who'd worked at the Louvre, admitted stealing it because he said he wanted it returned to Italy. He was caught when he tried to sell it to an Italian art dealer, who immediately alerted the authorities. So it was recovered, and it increased the fame of the Mona Lisa. You might wonder how much the Mona Lisa is valued. Well, there isn't any way of coming up with an estimate, but there was, I believe, an insurance company that came up with a value of $2.5 billion. Yes, billion. This, in fact, made the insurance cover so expensive that the Louvre found it was cheaper to install the best security systems than to pay the insurance cover for, based on that estimate. So I end with what is potentially the most valuable painting in the world, although we'll never know because it'll never be sold. So we end with what is in fact the world's most expensive painting, the painting alleged to be by Leonardo that I discussed just now. So that comes to the end of my talk for today.